Hello everyone and welcome back to the match that simply keeps on giving. It is Magnus Carlsen versus Moke and Niemann, and this is the third game of their match. If you are just joining in the match started by Niemann winning a brilliant game against Magnus with the black pieces, and then Magnus retaliated with a brilliancy of his own with the black pieces. Although Niemann's brilliancy was more of a middle game brilliancy, whereas Magnus's brilliancy was more of an endgame brilliancy. And now you'd think, okay, the match will probably quiet down a little bit. It's gonna be, a nice quiet game. Not really. Here, Magnus with the white pieces opens with pawn to a3. This is the so-called Anderssen opening. And for those of you who have been following the channel and have been through all of the videos, or at least those near the end of the Morphy saga, have probably seen this as it was played in the match between Paul Charles Morphy and A00 Anderssen, the famous one in Paris in 1858, it was a brilliant attempt by Anderssen to throw Morphy off guard, and he was successful at it. He defeated Morphy, and interestingly, Morphy replied with e5 to this move, but here instead of e5 we have pawn to d5. Now it's a very interesting idea playing something that differently than Morphy, because mostly when you have a position Morphy played, then you play what Morphy played. That's common sense because Morphy is the strongest, but Morphy lost this game, so maybe we could play something else here, and that's why Niemann goes pawn to d5. We have d4 by Magnus, knight to f6, knight to f3, and bishop to f5. Now we have pawn to c4, c6, and now there are some games where c captures on d5 was played, and also queen b3 putting pressure on d5, and b7 was played, but here Magnus plays knight to c3, and it is now already as of move 5 that we have a completely new game. So here pawn to e6, the bishop is out of the cage, so we might as well close the structure, and now knight to h4. Just a very standard idea. We're gonna eliminate this bishop. We attack it with the knight. Niemann already spent a few moves, just setting up this bishop so it would be positioned properly, so we might as well trade our knight for it. So bishop g4, and Niemann not interested in just going bishop g6 right away and allowing Magnus to capture it. Bishop to g4, we have pawn to f3, and now bishop to h5. We have c captures on d5, c captures, and now just g3. So Magnus playing some very weird chess here. Knight to c6, and now knight back to g2. We have queen to b6 now, putting pressure on that d4 pawn, and Magnus simply defends it. Pawn to e3, bishop to d6, and now knight to f4, putting pressure on the bishop here. And now you could just capture it. Bishop captures on f4, and even though this is good for black, it's hard to say what Magnus had in mind here. It's not like Niemann had this over the board or did any serious work how to play against a3. And if you're wondering why Magnus decided to play against a3, was it maybe to just completely confuse Niemann? Did he did some serious work on a3? Did he just want to assert his dominance? Probably a mixture of all of those things. Even though this is good for black, it's a completely wild position. Maybe you don't want to play this against Magnus. So bishop back to g6, knight captures, h captures, and now king to f2 by Magnus. Now he's gonna play king to g2, and what is even happening here? We have pawn to e6, now king to g2. And you can see that Tanya Sajda, one of the commentators of the official team, said that it's basically playing in the spirit of Bong Cloud. And here, yes, the king is in a very difficult spot, but this can't be good for white. But again, this brings me over to something Anish Giri said at some point. I think it was like maybe a month ago. He said that yes, you have these very strong engines, and they are giving all sorts of evaluations. Black is better, minus 0.5, or white is better, plus 1.5, or black is completely winning, plus 3. Yeah, he said it very well. You're either winning or you're not. You're either winning or it's a draw. Okay, or the other side is winning. But let's say one player is better. So you're either winning or it's a draw. It doesn't matter what the evaluations say. Even if it's like a +2.5, it's still either a draw or you're winning. So, it's a really weird way of looking at things, but it definitely makes a good point. So here, even though the engine prefers black, it doesn't really mean anything. So here we have castles. Niemann says, all right, my setup here is very strong, and your king is just weird. I'm going to bust open the position with e5, and you're going to have just a weird king's position. So here Magnus plays g4, and Niemann strikes right away with e5. We have pawn to g5 attacking the knight, but e captures on d4, not scared of Magnus's advancement. E captures on d4, and now knight to h5. We have knight captures on d5, attacking Niemann's queen here, and now queen captures on d4. And this is a weird decision by Niemann, going for a queen trade against Magnus. Here you go back, and now you have this position where Magnus has a king on g2, and still the board is full of pieces, so it definitely makes sense to do this. But he played queen captures on d4, and now Magnus very happily traded queens. Queen captures, knight captures, and now rook to b1, as knight to b3 could be very annoying. So rook b1, preparing b4, and now rook f to d8, putting the rook in front of the knight here, but just bishop to d3. There are no good discoveries, because there's always this nasty knight to b6 move. For example, if bishop captures on h2, hoping that you can win the knight, just knight b6. Now the rook is hanging, and also your bishop is hanging. So after bishop to d3, rook a to c8, and now we have rook to d1 by Magnus. And look at this spectacular party happening on the d file. I don't know if we've ever had 6 pieces on one file. Pretty sure we've had 5. I'm not sure about 6. So okay, knight to e6 and bishop to e4. Magnus improving the position of his bishop. King to f8, and now bishop to d2. At some point the bishop might assume this diagonal. We have knight h to f4 with check, and now comes knight captures on f4. Knight captures on f4 with check, and Magnus, not eager to give up the bishop pair, goes king to f1. We have b6 as the pawn on b7 is hanging, but now Magnus just plays bishop to b7, attacks the rook, and now will win the a6 pawn. So rook b8, bishop captures on a6, and now knight to e6. And now Niemann has to again face the very sad reality of being in an endgame against Magnus Carlsen, being down a pawn. So bishop to c4, and now knight to d4. The knight is very active, so even though Magnus has the bishop pair, the knight is a very strong piece here. So king g2 defending the pawn here, and now rook b to c8, putting pressure on the bishop. We have bishop to a6 now attacking the rook, and rook to c7. We have bishop to c3. This is very useful as we control this diagonal, and also you don't have to worry about any future infiltrating moves with the rook, like rook to c2. So knight back to e6, now putting pressure on the g5 pawn, and now we have pawn to a4. Very good stuff. The point is, if knight captures on g5, Magnus had in mind this rook captures on d6 maneuver, and now after rook captures on d6, you can just play bishop to b4, and you're gonna win the exchange back. So here after a4, we have king to e7. But now just pawn to h4, Magnus defends his g5 pawn. We have knight f4 check, king f2, and now knight back to e6, just harassing Carlsen's king. Bishop to b5, and now rook to h8, putting pressure on the pawn here. So rook to h1, a bit of a passive move for the white rook, but the black rook is also passive, so it's cool. Bishop to c5 with check, king to g3, and now bishop back to d6 with check, king back to g2 by Magnus. Now again knight to f4 with check, king f2, bishop to c5, and now king to g3. And now the problem is you can't continue with bishop to d6, even though you would very much like to, as now it seems like you're threatening all sorts of discoveries, but just rook b to e1 check, and you don't have a move. If you go to f8, then rook to e8 is checkmate, and if you go back knight to e6, open up a discovery. Now we just play f4, and not a worry in the world for you. Even though you can play bishop captures on f4 with check, after king to g4, it's still a much better, or rather a winning position for white. So no real worries here. If you go back bishop to d6, bishop captures on g7, then bishop comes to f6, and it's very ugly for black. Look at those bishops slicing all over the place. So instead, after king to g3, knight back to e6 once again, and now rook b to e1. Pinning this knight, we have bishop to d6 check, and now king back to g2. You could also play f4, but Magnus waits with the pawn. In game 1 against Hans, he pushed a pawn, and then of course he could never unpush it, so he's gonna wait with it. Pawn to f6, now comes rook to e4, preparing to double up on the e file, as now the f6 move has weakened the knight. Pawn to f5, now comes rook to c4, offering a trade of rooks. Knight to f4 with check, king to f2, and now bishop to c5 with check. And Magnus says, I've had it with your knight f4 check and bishop c5 check. Let's go for it. Rook captures on c5. Point being that if you capture with the pawn, which seems like a good idea, then bishop captures on g7, and there's always this bishop to f6 move that just makes it impossible for black to do anything with this rook. For example, if rook to a8, if you go here, then of course we just deliver a check. King has to go somewhere, and then bishop e5 will attack the knight, the rook on b8, and if you go for rook to a8, still bishop f6 check, and whatever you play, we're just gonna go for a double attack here. So after rook captures on c5, rook captures on c5 by Niemann, and now just bishop to b4, we're gonna win the material back. Knight to e6, and now of course bishop captures on c5. Knight captures, and now pawn to b4, meaning that a5 is coming, and of course Magnus will create a pass pawn. So knight e6, bishop to c4 now. Magnus just showing that he knows that the rook endgame is winning, and he really wants to trade this bishop for knight now. So Niemann decides not to allow this, and rook to e1 check. King d6, rook to d1, now threatening to pick up the knight. King e5, and now pawn to f4 with check, trying to give up a pawn to win the knight. So king e4, and now just bishop back to f1, preparing to push the a5 pawn, create a passer, and then win the game. So king back to d5, the king cannot really cross over to help out with the defense of the queen side, as the knight here would just be captured. So a5, not b4, b5, but rather b captures on a5, b captures on a5, and now rook to b8. We have pawn to a6, advancing the pawn, king to c5, and now just rook to c1 with check. King d6, and now king to e3, attacking the knight here. Knight to c6, and now rook to c3, not allowing any sneaky rook to b3 checks. And here, again, it's not possible for the black king to help out with the defense against this passed a pawn, because if you go king to c7, then the very simple bishop g2 just ends the game on the spot. Of course, white is now threatening to win the knight, and if you defend it, white very happily trades. Or rather, you can even push a7, doesn't really matter. The knight can't go anywhere. If king b7, we now trade. Rook captures, bishop captures, and now you cannot capture the bishop because white promotes the pawn to a queen, so you have to capture the pawn, and now you have a bishop against no pieces, of course, completely winning for Magnus. So after rook to c3, we have knight to a7, and now bishop to c4. We have rook to e8 with check, king to f3, and now rook to e7, trying to set up a blockade here, as you do have a light square bishop, so maybe the pawn cannot cross a dark square, but there are other problems for you to worry about. Rook to e3. Of course, a trade of rooks is winning for Magnus. So rook to d7, and now rook to d3 with check. King c7, and now Magnus shows why it is winning. Rook captures, king captures, and now bishop to f7. These pawns are on light squares. You attack the base of the pawn chain, and there is no defending this for black. So king c6, bishop captures, and g6 was played. King to b6, now comes pawn to h5, knight to c6, and now just h6, creating a passed pawn. G captures, and it was in this position on move 72 that Hans Moke and Niemann resigned the game, as there is nothing more to be done here. Magnus will just play pawn to h7, pawn to h8, bring a queen into the game, and of course that's it. If you try something like knight to e7, so if h7, then we can capture the bishop and guard the h8 square. Just bishop f7 guards both the g6 and this, so there's really nothing to worry about. Now you can escort your pawn freely up the board, and that's it. So of course Niemann knows this. After after g captures on h6, he resigned the game, and the Magnus takes a lead in the match, even though he lost the first game. So now he wins game 2. He wins game 3 by playing a3, the Adolf Anderssen's grand opening. Like I said, that was used in the legendary match against Paul Morphy. So truly incredible stuff. And for those of you who are interested, I could check, as game 4 is still being played, so I could check how game 4 ended. All right, I know how the game 4 ended. So if you guys are interested how the match ended, I will tell you now. If you're not interested, don't listen. Magnus has also won game 4 with the black pieces. So final result is 3-1. Niemann starts by winning game 1, and then Magnus wins 3 games in a row. And again, in game 4, Magnus played the g6, so it was just brutal. So yeah, that's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Really impressive stuff by Magnus. Not allowing Niemann any chances. There were some chances, but like Anish Giri said, you're either winning or you're not. If you're not, then your opponent can have a great game regardless of what the engine says. So always keep that in mind. Don't just listen to the engine. I would like to thank Alex Versilio, Francis Air, Ricky Emini, excellent subscriber, and Brandon Ward for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of the FTX Crypto Cup until it finishes. So thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.